This move immediately claims central space and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, preparing to develop pieces and contest control of the important central squares. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a complex and unbalanced opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn with a flank pawn, aiming to create an asymmetrical pawn structure and counterplay on the queenside. This move initiates the closed Sicilian, a system where white develops a solid pawn structure and aims for a kingside attack, avoiding the sharp, theoretical lines of the open Sicilian. This move, NC6, signals a commitment to one of the main variations of the Sicilian defense, developing a piece actively and preparing to contest the center by supporting the d-pawn. This move develops the knight to a less common square, potentially preparing for a d3 pawn push and a solid, yet flexible, structure, avoiding immediate confrontation in the center. This move prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, typically d6 or b4, and supports the central pawn on d5, aiming for a solid and flexible pawn structure. This move initiates a fianchetto of the king's bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling, characteristic of certain positional variations within the open Sicilian where white seeks a solid, flexible setup. This move aggressively challenges white's center, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially create a strong pawn majority in the center. This exchange opens the center, facilitating piece activity for both sides and potentially leading to an isolated queen's pawn for black if recaptures are handled precisely. This recapture opens the diagonal for the queen and establishes a central pawn majority for black, creating potential for future pawn pushes. This move develops the bishop to a good diagonal, aiming to control the long light squared diagonal and prepare for kingside castling. This move develops the knight to its natural square, preparing for castling and supporting a potential d4 pawn advance while controlling important central squares. This move, d4, immediately challenges black's central pawn presence and aims to open lines for white's pieces, potentially leading to a more dynamic and open game from the Sicilian Najdorf or English attack variations. This captures the central pawn, immediately opening lines and establishing central control for white's bishop on g2. This move recaptures the pawn on d5, centralizing the knight and preparing for further development while opening lines for the bishop. Developing the bishop to g4 pins the knight to the queen, limiting white's options and preparing to challenge the central tension. This move develops the queen to a more active square, preparing to castle queenside and support a potential central pawn push while also defending the knight. Developing the bishop to e7 prepares for kingside castling and contests the center while reinforcing the pawn on d5. This move challenges the bishop on g4, forcing it to either retreat or be exchanged, thereby addressing a positional weakness created by the earlier bishop development. This move develops the bishop, reinforcing the center and preparing to challenge white's knight on d4, while also creating potential attacking opportunities along the a2-8 diagonal. This exchange on d4 opens the e-file for white's rook and disrupts black's pawn structure, forcing a decision about recapturing the pawn. This pawn recapture strategically opens the f-file for your rook, creating attacking possibilities, and solidifies your central pawn structure. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and connects the rooks, preparing them for potential action on open files or central squares. This move completes the king's development to a safer square, which is crucial in this type of open Sicilian structure where white has pressure on the queenside and along the d-file. White develops the bishop to a square where it pressures black's queenside pawns and prepares to castle, aiming to control key central squares and exploit the slightly weakened pawn structure around black's king. This move challenges white's well-placed bishop and aims to disrupt white's coordination, potentially opening lines for black's pieces if the bishop retreats unfavorably. This move repositions the bishop to a safer square and prepares to contest the central d-file, reinforcing the pawn structure and potential for kingside play. This move activates the queen to a more central and active square, potentially supporting future pawn advances on the kingside or queenside while also connecting the rooks. This move repositions the rook to an open file, preparing to exert pressure on black's queenside and potentially support a central pawn push. This move develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the d4 pawn and creating a battery with the queen on the c5-1 diagonal. Kh1 tucks the king away from the open g-file and potential diagonal threats, a standard prophylactic move to improve king safety in the center. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the e-file and potentially redeploy the rook to a more active square, while also offering a retreat square for the bishop on c5 if needed. This move aims to prevent black's bishop from using the active c5 square and prepares a potential queenside expansion with b4. This move shores up the queenside, preventing white's knight or bishop from entering the b5 square and preparing for a potential advance of the b-pawn. This move aggressively challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to open lines for white's pieces, particularly the f-file, which could become a powerful attacking avenue. This move repositions the rook to the open d-file, creating immediate pressure on white's central pawn structure and preparing for potential exchanges or further advance into the opponent's territory. White initiates a flank pawn thrust to gain space and potentially open lines on the kingside, aiming to create attacking chances against black's uncastled king. The move 19, qf7 repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing white's kingside pawn push and potentially preparing to support counterplay on the kingside or central files. This aggressive pawn push aims to disrupt black's kingside and potentially open lines for white's pieces, though it weakens white's own kingside structure and requires careful follow-up. This move challenges white's advanced g-pawn and aims to disrupt white's kingside initiative by opening up lines for black's pieces. Exchanging knights on e4 simplifies the position and removes a strong attacking piece for black, but also opens the g-file for white's rook and allows black's doubled pawns to become less of a weakness. This pawn recapture opens the d-file for your rook and creates an outpost for your knight on e4, but also weakens the dark squares around your king, requiring careful defensive coordination. This move places the queen aggressively on the open c-file, targeting black's d5 pawn and preparing to exploit the open lines that have emerged after the recent exchanges. This move strategically places the bishop on a very active diagonal, directly challenging white's control of the center and eyeing potential weaknesses in white's kingside pawn structure. This move repositions the queen to prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or to support a central pawn break, while also eyeing weak squares like b7. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's development and open lines for counterplay, potentially targeting the weakened kingside pawn structure. Black has captured the bishop on b2. Material is now equal, but white's queen aggressively occupies the center, potentially exploiting the weak dark squares around black's king. Black recaptures the material on d2, aiming to exploit the open d-file and pressure white's slightly exposed king. This pawn grab opens the g-file for your rook, creating immediate attacking potential against black's king, while also forcing black to address the threat on the already compromised kingside structure. This move aims to activate the rook by moving it to a more central file where it can potentially support pawn advances or contest open lines, while also preparing to defend the h-pawn. This capture activates the bishop on e4, aiming to exploit white's doubled pawns on the kingside and potentially create new attacking chances on the open g-file. This aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside is an attempt to exploit white's slightly weakened pawn structure, but it dangerously exposes black's own king and may lead to tactical complications after white's likely response. White is seeking to complicate the position and force black to make difficult defensive decisions, aiming to exploit the open lines and potential weaknesses around the black king. The move red 7 aims to consolidate the rook on the d-file, potentially supporting a pawn push or preparing for future operations while keeping the queen protected. White aims to regroup the queen to a more central and active square, supporting the central pawn structure and potentially preparing for further action against black's weakened king or on the queenside. The move 28, Nay7 is a defensive maneuver, repositioning the knight to protect the kingside from potential attacks and to prepare for a possible regrouping to the d5 or f5 squares. This pawn sacrifice on g7 opens lines for your attacking pieces, aiming to exploit the uncastled king's position and create mating threats. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure white's kingside and potentially create counterplay. The move qb3 attempts to regroup the queen, aiming to create potential threats on the queenside while also defending the pawn on b2 and maintaining a flexible central presence. The king's move to g7 is a necessary reaction to the immediate threat posed by white's queen and pawn on the g-file, aiming to consolidate the king's position and prepare for potential counterplay. This capture removes a key defender of black's king and opens lines, while the subsequent pawn structure change will be crucial in the endgame. This pawn capture, while recapturing material, opens the g-file and provides white's king with a critical escape square, while black's own king is now exposed to potential threats. This king's knight check forces the black king to an exposed square, opening lines for white's rooks and potentially leading to a decisive attack.